I don't know, the next one, I'll leave that up to Reverend Christie about recording, because I don't anticipate tonight the focus will be on personal conversation. Although if you have questions or points to make, absolutely feel free to do so. The chat box is the easiest way to get a quick point across or quick question, but we'll also stop every so often. The reason I'm saying that this won't necessarily be dialogue focused, although I love dialogue, there's a lot of material that I want to try to cover tonight. And I'll be realistic, you know, if things are heading in one direction, I may just like pull back on some other areas. But the idea that came up over the summer, as Michael and I think we can use first names here. I have, you know, Joshua, please. We were talking about partnering between our congregations, which we felt was very important, of course, following the George Floyd moment. And you know, I think we've come really a long way in a very short time in beginning these conversations. But almost immediately, one topic came up, the topic of wanting, first of all, studying together, which this isn't necessarily part of. I mean, I think we're going to have meetings between the congregations. This is more of a general educational program, but studying together, particularly biblical studies, which we share, particularly on issues of how did racism begin? What are the roots of racism, the biblical roots, the religious roots, and where each of our faiths stands on main issues of racism, main issues surrounding the large issue, this greatest challenge of racial discrimination and xenophobia, you know, fear of the other. So I thought it would be a good idea, and I took him up on the challenge, especially regarding the curse of Ham. Now, it's something that I had certainly known about because I've studied the Bible all my life, but I had very little background as to how important it was and is in terms of the history of racism and enslavement in particular, Black enslavement especially, and its role, even currently. And I read some of Ibram X. Kendi's books, and that also reinforced the notion that this is really important. So and as I was preparing for the high holidays, I looked into Jewish sources on this, and I found some very interesting things. I'm going to share some of those with you tonight. I'll show you in a moment what I'm going to be sharing just in a general sense, my ambitious goals that I may not completely fulfill. But that especially was one that I wanted to make sure to cover. So how many, just like even a show of hands, if you have familiarity with the curse of Ham? If you ever, you know, some people think it's about, you know, keeping kosher. No, it's not that. Like if a Jew eats ham, he's cursed. No, that's not what we're talking about. So I will get into it, and you know, it's something that now I feel very knowledgeable about, but only because I've been doing the research, and I never understood before what was important about it. All right, so I'm going to be doing that, and also talking more about the tensions within Judaism. So tonight will be primarily Judaism focused, and the tensions having to do with being inclusive and welcoming, love your neighbor as yourself, and being, as I said, xenophobic, being fearful of the other, separatist. And those tensions certainly exist within Judaism. So I'll give one more little preamble to this, and that is that, you know, I think it's really important that when we have this kind of dialogue, that we be honest. And rather than try to sugarcoat or give propaganda, I mean, I can do a great job of that. Judaism really isn't based on that. Judaism is based on struggle. The word Israel means to struggle with God. Jacob got that name in last week's Torah portion, in fact. And there are things within Judaism that I struggle with. There are things that rabbis struggle with. We'll see in the texts, they're struggling with each other. And some of them are not well, they're a little bit embarrassing. Some of them are not the things I'm proudest of my own faith. But I'm not actually going to show you the worst ones. But it is important to struggle. It is important to come to grips with these things. Now, when you are looking at a text, an ancient text, I'll go off subject and say, let's say a sexist, misogynistic text. There is no shortage of those within rabbinic literature. And it's very easy to say, well, that was for their time. And that's absolutely true in one sense, that, times were different, standards were different. We deal with the same thing dealing with even current day America. When we look at, the very racist cartoons of the 1940s and 50s, and we ask ourselves, how could people watch those? I mean, we could look at things from 5 years ago, Frank. We could look at things from before last June and wonder how Americans could watch these things or accept these things or be tolerant of these things. The Confederate flag, for instance. So I understand that I shouldn't pass judgment, while at the same time, it's still important to be critical. The other thing in terms of Jewish history, which, I'll sort of mention as we go along, remind you, there haven't been too many times during Jewish history where we've been that comfortable. And I'm going to say we a lot, just because I'm a Jew. But, when you're under persecution, when you are facing constant discrimination, sometimes the way to lash out is in writing, in text, especially in languages that people aren't going to be able to read, who are different from you. So it's sort of like this internal texting that goes on that you'll often see in many cultures that will be a little bit more derogatory toward other groups than you would like to see. That having been said, I think we need to get going here. So I am going to start by can you all see this? I hope you can. All right, so this is where I hope to go. Just let me know if you can't see it. You can see it, right? All right, so where I hope to go. Talk a little about loving your neighbor as yourself and the generations of Adam. We'll get into this. Then, not too far down the road, we'll get to the curse of Ham and Canaan and Cain, which is another interesting twist on this, and Cush, who's a part of this picture. Then if we have time, we can talk a little about enslavement in biblical and other Jewish sources, because that's important, but I don't anticipate we're going to have a lot of time tonight, because I don't want to really overdo it. We're scheduled for 90 minutes, by the way, but really we'll see, how far you want to go. All right, so this is where I want to be by the end of tonight with conclusions. That sounds good, right? All right, so let me start. Actually, this is a nice photo to start with. And I love this picture. This actually is not during the March on Washington, but here's Dr. King with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who has been understood to be sort of you can't call him the Jewish Dr. King, but he came at around the same time and expressed the same prophetic message with the same incredible cadence and articulation, although his mostly is found in his writing as opposed to his oratory. Coming from Europe, he wasn't as comfortable with English, but his writing is amazing and has withstood the test of time. But his message is thoroughly prophetic, and they were kindred spirits, to the point where you can see in this photo, which was, by the way, at a protest for the Vietnam War, 1968, you see the cross and the Torah almost as bookends. And that one of the reasons, and you have the symbol of American philosophy and structure in the middle, but you have this sense of religion's central role in the two of their missions together. And this is a wonderful place to start as well. This was a telegram that Heschel wrote to JFK in 1963. Now, why did he write it? He was invited to speak at a conference on racism at that time, and very famous speech that he delivered then among his most famous utterances. And it's hard to read, but this telegram sent to JFK, basically he is saying, he's asking the president to call for a national repentance and personal sacrifice. That it is a state of spiritual emergency. Actually, he calls it a state of moral emergency. And at the end, he's calling everyone out, fellow clergy, political leaders, that he said the hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity, which, by the way, is the book of compilations of his writings that Susanna Heschel, his daughter, put together. That is just a very, very powerful book that put together posthumously. Moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. If that's not a calling for all of us, I don't know what is. And the partnership between blacks and Jews that existed, that was personified by that relationship between King and Heschel, is one that we are now trying to rebuild, to reinvent. So anyway, it sort of comes from that. Now, a lot of it stems from the Golden Rule, because the Golden Rule is something that we all share. In fact, not only us, but all major religions. You can see in Judaism, there are several articulations of it, but the one that's mentioned here is from the Talmud. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary from the sage Hillel. Christianity and everything do unto others as you would have them do unto you. For this is the law and the prophets. Jesus from Matthew. And this whole notion of love your neighbor as yourself is a foundation. If we're talking about Judaism's inclusivity, there's no more inclusive statement than that. There are a couple of other statements in Scripture that really bring us to this notion of inclusivity. One is that all human beings are created in God's image. Tselem Elohim is the terminology used in Genesis at the time of the creation of man and woman. In God's image, God created them. And what does it mean to be in God's image? Well, so this Mishnah, this is rabbinic passage from 2nd, 3rd century, around that period. And this is a seminal passage, an important passage to understand this. So I'm just going to read it for you. Only one man, Adam, was originally created in order to teach us that if one destroys a single life, it is as if he destroyed the entire world. While if one saves a single life, it is as if he saved an entire world. Also, only one person was initially created, Adam. Of course, Eve also, but let's focus on Adam, for the sake of peace, so that no one should be able to claim lineage superior to another person. Also, that heretics could not use multiple creations to support the idea of multiple deities. So they're sticking in a little philosophy there. This also demonstrates God's greatness because a human can stamp out many coins using the same die, and they are all identical. But God stamped out every person from the seal of Adam, but no two are alike. Therefore, every person should say, the world was created for my sake. So love your neighbor as yourself is important, but this Mishnah, this rabbinic piece of literature, seems to be saying there's something even more important than love your neighbor as yourself, and that is that we all have a single ancestor, or a single couple, man and woman, but let's say Adam, just because that's the terminology they use. Adam, by the way, just means human. It's genderized to mean man, but it really means human. And so being in God's image, and this is the foundation of all Jewish inclusivity, once again, teaches us three things about life. We find it in this passage, which is why it's so important. One destroys a single life, it's as if he destroyed an entire world. And saves a life, save a world. That is actually, that's well known even in Hebrew school among Jewish kids. I mean, it's taught and retaught and taught again. It's a foundational teaching because it teaches that every life, every human life, is of infinite value. You cannot quantify a life. You cannot say any human life, whatever color, whatever race, whatever ethnicity, whatever religion. It doesn't say just Jews. Every human life, you cannot say is worth 3/5 of another human life. You cannot say is worth a penny, which is, by the way, how much the Nazis spent on each Jew that they killed with Zyklon B. They limited their order of the poisonous gas in order to save money. So what they did was they used less on each load of Jews that they would, and my teacher, Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, calculated this. They had the bills because the Germans kept so much of this information. They had the bills, they had the paperwork, so they knew, and they cut the amount, which meant that it took twice as long for people to die. And yet they saved, you know, of course they saved it, and it was like it was less than a penny per person. That is not possible with this saying. Teach one, destroy one life, destroy a world, save a life, save a world. Infinite value. So that's one. Number two, only one person was created for the sake of peace, so that no one should be able to claim lineage superior to another person. When they say all men are created equal, this is the foundation from the Jewish perspective, but going back to the Bible, being in God's image. All human beings are created equal. And there is no one better than anyone else. And that's very specific here. And finally, a human can stamp out many coins, same die. They, you know, remember the Roman era, lots of Roman coins, but the same mold. But God, miraculously, and they didn't know a lot about genetics back then, but they knew enough to realize that when two people have a kid, the kid doesn't look exactly like his or her parents. They understood that everyone is unique. So I'm just gonna get off of the share because it's you gotta like see people once in a while. So it's really important, looking from the Jewish perspective, to have those three things in common. We're all created in God's image. Human life is of infinite value. All are equal, yet each of us is unique. That's what makes us human, and that's what forces on us a philosophy of inclusivity, or at least it draws us toward that. So I want to stop here for a second. I know it's just one major quote, but does anyone have any questions, comments? Do you disagree? Okay, I'll go on. I'm going to keep doing this because I never want to go too far. All right.
Rabbi.
Yes.
If someone have a question, they can raise their hand in the chat and I can let you know. Would you want me to wait until you pause, or should I?
No, you can let me know. But I'll also see if the chat is being used.
I'll monitor the chat for you. And if somebody wants to ask a question, they can just raise their hand in the chat.
Okay. All right. So now, this brings us back to an interesting question. Which verse is more important? This is, again, in rabbinic literature. Same basic period, a little later, perhaps 3rd, 4th centuries, land of Israel or Babylonia, probably Babylonia in this case. No, actually, land of Israel, because it mentions Rabbi Akiva, one of the most famous rabbis from the 2nd century. And he says that love your neighbor as yourself is the most important principle in the Torah because it covers everything. But Ben Azai, who probably looked at that passage that I just read or imagined it if it hadn't been written yet, says, no, this is the numeration of the generations of Adam. That comes later in the book of Genesis. In the likeness of God was Adam created. Once again, Tselem Elohim, in God's image. That's also found later in Genesis, right after the creation story, just as we saw it in the creation story itself. He says that is an even greater principle. And a fascinating discussion might be, does anyone here feel that that one is much more important than the other? And if so, which one? Because this is a common debate in Judaic circles in the rabbinic period. Is it more important to love your neighbor as yourself, Or is it more important to recognize that we all have a common ancestor, meaning Adam, or Adam and Eve? So, okay, I'm going to cut to the chase. No, really, I'm not begging for comments, but if you had something, you know, they wanted to say, that's fine. Okay, so really both. I mean, there's a good case to be made for both. But because of what I just showed you before, it's probably easier to see that we have a common ancestor leading to loving your neighbor as yourself than it is for us to say, love your neighbor as yourself, and that'll bring us to having that, you know, understanding our commonality.
Mm.
For one thing, it doesn't really tell you, you know, who your neighbor is.
Mm.
Is your neighbor just your Jewish neighbor? Is your neighbor just the person who lives next door to you? When you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's broken down in later conversations, we'll see a little bit of it, to be fairly generalized. It's not just about love your Jewish neighbor as yourself. But still, re'echa means someone who is a friend, someone who's an acquaintance, someone who you know. And Ben Azai's goes all the way back to every single human being. And, you know, whenever anyone asks me, did the dinosaurs happen? What's compatible with, you know, the creation story? Do you take it literally? From my perspective, and I think from the perspective of many, especially progressive Jews, that's not the point. The literal 7 days, what happened each day, you know, could be somewhat parallel to the evolution of life. And, you know, we can talk about Big Bang and compare it. And there are some commonalities. But in truth, what's most important is this. What's most important is there is one ancestor, which, by the way, anthropology has somewhat verified, except they found Eve, I believe, our common ancestress in Africa. But what's most important is that there is one source. And that one source then extends into Noah's generation, 10 generations later. That's where things get a little more complicated, as we'll see. But whatever it is, you still go all the way back to Adam and Eve. And love your neighbor as yourself doesn't do that. All right, so let's see. I don't need to, well, loving, what does it mean to love? So is it like love people who are like you? And here, this is a discussion in Midrash, which is commentary of Jewish sources. And so here, it's saying, don't hate others. To love, it's not about loving people who are sages and hating disciples, or loving the disciples and hating the Am Haaretz, which would be the sort of rural dwellers. Or as American politics would say, the less educated. The rule is love them all, but you can still hate some. So love your neighbor as yourself is qualified here. Hate heretics, apostates, seducers, and informers. Okay, I'm not a great lover of seducers and informers. But what's interesting here when it says about what does it mean love your neighbor as yourself? Who do you love? Who do you hate? It's not talking about ethnicity here. It's not talking about race, certainly, to the degree that they even would have understood race. It's talking about people who, who don't act in proper ways. And purpose, we talked a little about criminal justice reform, and I think hating is not what we should do for those who break the law or those who are caught up in a horrible system that has, imposed harsh punishment. So I wouldn't agree with this either, but it's interesting to note that there are many interpretations. I just took this as one example of why loving your neighbor as yourself can become complicated. Okay, so now we get to the other one, that all generations go back to Adam. So who was Adam? And there is a teaching in the Talmud which tries to flesh out what does it mean? Are all humans, really related to Adam, going back to Adam? And I won't get into the halachic, the Jewish legal complications, but it has to do with the impurity of a corpse. And so it's like cooties. I mean, I really don't want to get into the details of it, but what we have in the Talmud is a quote that seems to indicate that there's a status, a human status that is conferred upon Jews that is not conferred upon those who aren't Jewish. Again, it has nothing to do with race, nothing to do with, even with ethnicity, it has to do with Jewish peoplehood, a covenant. But it's an interesting thing that comes up in some of these sources. And, in terms of obligation to Jewish law, there's no question that Jews are obligated to do certain things that the commandments, not just the 10 commandments, but many, there are 613, that non-Jews are not. But this kind of classification of difference is disturbing to me. And it's disturbing to many because it does sort of differentiate. And you see that especially in the mystical strains of Judaism. In Kabbalah, you see it in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, I believe, yes, was the rabbi who's mentioned here. He's sort of a founder of Jewish mysticism. You see it even in modern Hasidism. They talk about Jewish souls as being qualitatively different, not so much superior, but different from non-Jewish souls. You'll see that in the works of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, in fact, and modern Hasidism. You see it a lot in sources that are otherwise fascinating and interesting and positive, but those are disturbing. But then you go to Maimonides, and again, I'm not going to get into the Jewish legal aspect of this having to do with corpses and purity. Maimonides was a strict philosopher. He lived in the Muslim world, not the Christian world, in Spain and then North Africa. He interacted with his non-Jewish neighbors a lot. He was a physician in the court of the ruler in Egypt. So Maimonides was clearly a man of the world, and he makes very clear, and not a mystic in any sense, that that both Jews and Gentiles are equal in impurity, imparting through. And again, I'm not going to get into how you can become pure and impure, but that they're equal. That's the key to Maimonides responding to what I just said before. And he then states that he goes back to the Talmud because he can't totally disregard it. It's in the Talmud, that troubling sentence that showed inequality going back to, Adam. And he says that's the exception to the rule, the ohel, as he calls it, the tent. But otherwise, through carrying other things, there is no question that there's equality. So again, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but just to say that there is a debate in Jewish sources, even about this whole question of us all coming from Adam and Eve. That even if we come from Adam, there are still some that have more, it's like Animal Farm. Everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. So now, I'm just going to get us past this little segment, because I think it's important. This is an Orthodox rabbi in the 19th century who is speaking about that Talmudic passage that was troubling to me and obviously to him. And it says very clearly that you are called human being, and it is conceivable, the rabbis would say about idolaters, maybe that is it conceivable that they're not human? And he is basically saying that their behavior may not be right, but the Talmud says, and the Talmud says this is a key passage, so I want to just highlight this. It's the last sentence of the first paragraph. Righteous Gentiles have a place in the world to come. In the Talmud, it says that those who are good, those who are righteous, Jews and non-Jews have a place in heaven. If that wasn't inclusivity, I don't know what is. And of course, that's different from what some other faiths and or other denominations might state. And, you know, we can get into that, you know, either now or next week as to what Christianity states, because I know there are many different, you know, many different views, but who gets into heaven? So the rabbis are very clear in the Talmud that Jews and non-Jews both get into heaven. And then he goes on, this is 19th century again, this Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz in Germany, of all places, that wasn't a great bastion of tolerance even back then. And he's going on to list all of these, you know, really important non-Jewish people, like Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. Where would we even have the Talmud? The Talmud was, I think, the first thing printed on a Gutenberg, or I guess the Bible, but it definitely started to be printed around the same time. Or he mentions, I don't even know, and there's a question mark here because I don't think the person who told this source knows who invented a cure for bubonic plague. But whoever it is, we got to put him back to work. And then the guy, Draker, who brought the potato to Europe. So he picks three things and says, these people weren't Jewish. They were important. Who are we to, you know, possibly say that they're lesser humans than we are? The guy who invented the potato, the guy who invented the printing press, and the guy who, you know, got rid of bubonic plague. I'm sure there have been others. But anyway, that's interesting, the way he, you know, has come to understand this. And then finally this, and this ends this section, okay? This was a guy also in the 19th century who says the essence of neighborly love consists in loving all mankind. And this is, by the way, he's Hasidic. And I mentioned before that Hasidism tends to be more chauvinistic, more on the chauvinistic side, more mystical. But he comes right out and speaks to his people and says, anyone who walks on two legs, whatever they speak, whatever, builders, farmers, merchants, artisans, human society is to be conceived of as a single individual composed of many organs and parts. Each person is like an organ or part of this individual. All are interdependent and interconnected like the links of a chain. The meaning of the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is not confined to Jews only, but the sense is your neighbor who is a human being as yourself. People of all nations are included, any fellow humans. So I always like to stop on a positive note. Anyway, any comments, questions? We're good. So, you know, so here's where we've gone so far.
Pause, Rab. Just give them 2 more seconds. I know there's a question. That was Rich.
Oh, all right. I don't see it in the chat.
No hands were raised, but you've got to have a question.
Okay.
All right.
Go for it.
No questions.
Oh, I thought maybe you had one.
I have lots of questions, but I'll save them till later.
Okay. All right. Well, you know, it's, you know, this is hard because I'm really sort of opening up, and there are aspects of Jewish sources that I'm not totally comfortable with, and normally I'm not comfortable even when I'm just in a totally, you know, internal congregational setting.
Yes.
Like at a bar mitzvah, I'm not going to say that, you know, someone said certain people who aren't Jewish are less than human. That doesn't sound good.
Right.
Especially, and now Aunt Josephine is going to have the next Aliyah. You know, I have no idea who's married to who, and you know, whatever. It's not a very comfortable situation. But again, I hope people understand that, you know, this is really a people who have grown and through the ages to be very wary of those who are, you know, sort of outside the boundaries of Judaism. We've been burned so many times, and I think that's where the Jewish and Black experience can share with one another. You know, how hard is it to trust? How hard is it to really love your neighbor as yourself when you've felt victimized so often by that same neighbor, even though that was your grandparents, not necessarily you in the same
Right.
way. So,
Well, I appreciate your vulnerability, and Jeff had a question or a comment.
Well,
go ahead, Jeff.
it's more of a comment. I know there are certain rules in the Torah, or at least I believe, I'm not that big a Torah scholar, that have sort of different rules for Jews, and then there are rules for Jewish people to deal with people who aren't Jewish. And that always struck me as being a little strange in our time. And I always sort of attributed it to they're sort of set up for survival, that at various times the most important thing was for us to survive as a people. So these walls were built around us to sort of protect us from the outside world. And it was older and sort of old fashioned. I think we're more enlightened now.
Right. I think we are, in a sense, heading to a very different world. You know, I speak about the world of kosher versus kesher. Kosher boundaries, setting boundaries. Of course, we think of it in terms of food boundaries, dietary laws, but it's really about, you know, do's and don'ts having to do with things you don't eat, people you don't relate to, etc. And kesher means connection. We're now in a world of profound and deep connection that is getting more connected all the time. And I think Judaism is shifting its sights, as are other faiths, to be able to remain distinct while forging those connections. And what's really interesting is that Judaism never really was chauvinistic when looked at the right way. It seems it at times with the things you're describing, Jeff, but setting those boundaries also had a lot to do with covenant, with the special contract that was signed with God at Mount Sinai between God and the Jewish people, which didn't make it any easier to be a Jew or any more privileged. The whole notion of chosenness, I think, is a misnomer. It's not really about being chosen. It's about having responsibilities, and certain responsibilities to bring, you know, a vision of goodness to the world, as Christians do too. We all have that, you know, different in a different sense, but we all have that obligation to bring a message to the world, the Torah being our message. And so having distinctions between Jews and non-Jews, or between like Sabbath and other days of the week or foods, you know, is part of the medium of that message. But the message is love your neighbor as yourself. You know, that's the message. We just have to find the right medium to deliver it. And the other message being we're all descended from the same human being. So I want to now.
Donna has a question.
Oh, Donna, go for it.
It's the same question of the two messages that I was going to bring up before. I don't think they sit well with me. I'm good with love your neighbor as yourself. I'm not good with the other one.
We're all descended from the same.
Yeah, because it makes us set up as the other. It makes us set up as the chosen. It makes us set up as jingoistic. It just feels bad to me.
Wait, all meaning all humans, not just all Jews.
Yeah, I know. Oh, I know. But it gets interpreted along the lines of, you know, Jews are we were the ones with the covenant with God. We were the ones who got the Torah. We were the ones who got the law. And, you know, I find that sets me up as somebody different than my friends and neighbors. And I just don't buy that, that I'm different or special, more special than anyone else. So that's me.
That's a great point. And I think, you know, I agree that if it's about your quality as a person, being more special, I struggle with that too. But having different responsibilities, I mean, I can begin to look at it, you know, in that way. Commitments, let's say, obligations. If I'm married to someone, I have certain commitments and obligations to that person, which doesn't make me any better than someone who doesn't have those same obligations and commitments.
Right.
It's
And I have very Orthodox family on my late husband's side who are very rigid in they don't mingle with anybody other than Jews.
Yeah, I know many like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. We could, you know, that it's an interesting topic because I think what we're finding are those who are willing to mingle, and more than mingle, but actually partner, are finding deeper potential for sharing among those of other faiths who have that commitment than some, you know, some who are more on the side of chauvinism. It is a fault line among different in different religions, but definitely in Judaism we see it, and I wanted to show it to you here because it definitely exists, even in terms of loving your neighbor as yourself, and in terms of Adam. You know, that's, I think, what you were responding to, those quotes that were differentiating between the Adam, you know, that the human being that is a Jew and the human being that isn't a Jew.
right.
So now, you know, so here's, and this was a good place to begin, because here's sort of the, you know, where I'm finally getting to what Michael and I have been wanting to talk about, and that is this whole curse of Ham thing. And this is the passage from Genesis. So Noah, you know, they just came out of the ark. Noah, remember, has a wife. He's got 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japhet, and they have their families. And the first thing Noah does when he comes out of the ark is plant a vineyard, because what would you do if you've been, you know, away for 40 days and 40 nights, but want to have some wine? But really, planting a vineyard is more than just about wine. It's about celebrating life, because actually that is sort of what wine does, but it's also about planting for the future. The idea of planting means you think you're going to live more than one season, and probably more than 3 or 4 years before the grapes are really good enough for a vineyard. I mean, you can get cucumbers pretty quickly, but a vineyard takes a while. So, I mean, it's a beautiful thought. But, you know, all right, so let's say a few years pass, he has the wine, he's drunk, and he's naked because he's drunk. And Ham sees him naked and doesn't cover him up, but instead he tells his brothers. Now, we could say he was malicious. We could say he just was worried. I mean, look at Dad. Oh, my God. Whatever it was, the other 2 took a garment and they walked backwards. It's an interesting thing because the Torah doesn't usually give detail like that. So clearly the Torah's narrative is on the side of that Ham had done something that was disrespectful, because they were much more respectful. They covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were backward, and they didn't see their father's nakedness. So Shem and Japhet did a good thing. Ham, questionable. Did he murder someone? Was this like Cain and Abel? Did he steal? No. I mean, was there even sexual immorality? Perhaps, actually. We don't know. But it's not explicitly said. So Shem, Ham, and Japhet are Noah's kids. Noah awakens, and he knew what his youngest son had done to him. Interesting, because we just named them. Shem, or the beginning of the Noah story. Ham is the middle son. He's not the youngest son. So this is a little confusing. He's probably talking about Japhet. But he's not even talking about him in verse 25, because he then says, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren." So who is Canaan? Well, Canaan isn't Ham. And in this case, Canaan is Ham's kid. So what's going on here? And then Noah goes on to say, "Blessed be God, the God of Shem." And you should know that Shem is sort of the favored son. He ends up being, well, we call them Semites. So we are Semites, Jews are Semites, Christians are Semites. We're all sort of, at least if we see our line as being from the line of Abraham, we start from Shem. And let Canaan be their servant. Canaan is going to be the servant of Shem. And God enlarges Yafet. It's actually a play on words. Yaft Elohim liyafet, the same word basically. So it's a play on words. He shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be their servant. So Canaan's going to be the servant of the two other brothers. And then Noah lived 350 years. If you look at what we call in rabbinic work, the Peshat, the basic text right here, the only curse that happens is of Canaan, and we have no idea why. Mm-hmm. We have no idea. I mean, so let's move from that. And anyway, and I should probably stop here, because I think, Michael, if you could just in a sentence or two tell us what just reading Kendi's work, I get the sense that so much was made of Ham being cursed. Did they ever bring up Canaan at all? And before I go any farther, can you enlighten us a little bit on that?
Yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate you laying out the story you just did, because it made it look like Noah was just a drunk saying all kind of stuff that he wasn't even sure of. It's like, yeah, it's that one. No, it's that one. So curse everybody. So the idea is that Ham, which some interprets to mean black or hot.
Ham does mean hot in Hebrew.
Yes.
Yes.
And those two words, just those two definitions, black and hot, and heat rather, was interpreted, exegesis, that must relate to black people. That was how they translate. That's how they got spread to all black folks. So Ham was the father of Africa, essentially, since he was black and since they were the only one around. So he must be the African. And so then, therefore, everything in Africa is cursed. All of its people are cursed. And essentially, if we fast forward, the white European Christians were then to be the savior of this cursed nation, since they're supposed to serve their brothers. And this language was used by the early theologians to justify slavery in the construct of the Americas. And
that's like in the 1600s, right? I mean,
yes.
You see it popping up. I did some research.
Yes.
And but the slave trade already existed when Ham was brought in, or not? That's part I couldn't really tell, because it seems like Kendi was saying, at least in one of his books, that this was brought in to justify, the financial windfall that these traders, wanted to justify.
Yes, the curse of Ham was an invention of during the European slave development. So not only Europe, but the Americas. When all of that was emerging, Christianity was the popular religion, the emerging religion, right? Especially in England and most of Europe, and certainly in the Americas. And so it was, I was going to talk a little bit about this next week, but I'll tease you with it now. It was one of there was three prongs to cultivating kind of whiteness in America. And one of the strongest one was theology. Because if you remember, back in the 1500s, theology and religion was very strong. Next to the president and the king was like the priest and the bishop and the pope, and they wield lots of power. And so these scholars and theologians would interpret this text and says, yes, look, There's evidence right here in the Bible that Black people are supposed to be our slaves.
Now, do you recall ever hearing of any like connection to Jewish interpretation in making, you know, in sort of drawing out this justification?
No. I not in my experience coming up. I never heard a Jewish interpretation. I've since read some since. A great book that I'm looking, David Goldenberg. Are you guys familiar with him?
I think so. What's
David Goldenberg he writes a book. It looks like a chemistry book, the way with all the words and symbols and studies. It's called The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He's a Jewish scholar, and I'll tell you where he's from. He Teresa Cohen Chair of Jewish Religion and Thoughts at the University of Cape Town and a visiting scholar professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also the president, or was the president, of the Dorpsby College for Hebrew and Cognitive Learning, and the associate director of Annenberg Research Institute for Judaic and Near Eastern Studies.
So yeah, and I know we will be getting back to this next week, and you know, please mention to people that you know, weren't able to come on tonight. I will post the recording here, but also that we can go over some of this again, because I think this is really important, that the justification, the theological justification for enslavement of Black Africans comes from this story of the Bible, that there are Jewish sources that are racist, but primarily, both in terms of the Torah itself and later literature, sees it totally differently. So, you know, I want to show you just some of that because I think it's really important. So, all right, so here is Midrash. Again, this is 2nd, 3rd century. Noah brought his sons and grandsons and blessed them, gave them as an inheritance all the earth. He blessed Shem and his sons, making them dark but comely. Shem, not Ham. Shem, the eldest, who's the one we're related to. I mean, we're meaning the rabbinic Jews of Palestine, who were, you know, face it, Middle Eastern. So they were not, you know, they were not, you know, Scandinavian. Anyway, and comely, which I think is important in Hebrew. The language is also very similar. Shorim v'na'im. Shachor is black, but na'im means nice. If you want to know the origin of black is beautiful, it's right here. Okay. Yeah. He gave them the habitable earth. Okay, so like everything's divided equally. Shem, you get all the earth. You know, Ham, making them dark like the raven, he gave them as an inheritance the coast of the sea. Okay, we'll give you a little sliver. We'll give you Florida. You can have it. I don't know. Now, all right, the raven doesn't seem to be a compliment. But I think from their perspective, if darkness is not seen as ugly, then being darker, it's a comparative term. And remember, they did have some experience of Africa. They weren't that far from it. There were traders all the time. And of course, Jewish history began with slavery in Egypt. So, and then Japhet and his sons, they're entirely white. And he gave to them an inheritance, the desert and its fields. So, you know, the white people don't necessarily get the best stuff.
They get the worst part.
Yeah. And, you know, you got to think, Lawrence of Arabia, but, you know, I don't know where they got this notion of who lives where based on skin color. But that's about the only thing you find. You don't find a lot of skin color. You find some curiosity, but you don't find negativity. You don't find what I would call racism here. And yes, I'm an apologist. I'm a rabbi. What am I, you know, there are passages I am not showing you, but this is there. All right, so this is a commentary And this is another part of it that's important. This is from Ibn Ezra, who lived in medieval Spain. And so Ham is the father of Canaan. So we know that, and this is brought out in the genealogies. So getting back to why is Canaan cursed? All right, so he writes that Ham and Canaan were wicked. As the father does, so does the children. So there's a little lesson in parenting. Canaan, and not Cush. Cush is another one of his kids. Cush came to be known as Ethiopia. We'll get to Cush in a second. Canaan is mentioned in this verse because Canaan was going to be cursed. This chapter was written to inform us that all Canaanites, both male and female, bear a curse from the time of Noah. This explains a lot of what's going to happen. It pre-sages, pre-envisions what's going to happen later in the Torah, in Jewish history, in Jewish Hebrew history, Israelite history. Because what's going to happen, first of all, Abraham does not want his son Isaac to marry a Canaanite in Genesis. That's just a few chapters later. And so he ends up sending his servant, Abraham does, to the land of their ancestors, where Eliezer, the servant, finds a wife for Isaac basically from the family. And then this commentary also talks about the Hittites and the Amorites also were cursed, and they are the descendants of Canaan. So what do the Hittites, Amorites, and Canaanites have in common, aside from this, issue of who you marry and who you don't? They were all geopolitical adversaries of the Israelites when they conquered the land after the 40 years of wandering. Joshua and beyond. The issue was not slavery or racism or anything like that. It was geopolitical conquest. They had to justify dispossessing the Canaanites of their land. By the way, this has nothing to do with the modern day Middle Eastern. The Canaanites are not Palestinians. The Israelites were not current Israelis. We shouldn't try to extrapolate, but we're talking about what happened back then. They were enemies, but actually they weren't really enemies. They were more like frenemies, because the reason the prophets all talk about don't marry the Canaanites and the Hittites and all these other people is because that's what they were doing. They were all living in the same place and they were mixing. And so, the more orthodox leaders were saying you shouldn't do that.
Right.
Things don't change.
Yeah.
So
Josh,
go for it.
I got a question. How many sons did Ham have? Do you recall?
I don't recall. I have, but
So he had more than the Canaanites, because he had Canaanite and Cush.
Yeah. I mean, I know of those two. I don't know that there were others.
Right, and only Canaan. Even if you would go on the argument that there's some legitimacy to the cursing of Canaan, that doesn't speak to the entire continent of Africa and to all Black people.
It's
right?
Not Canaanite, they're not in Africa at all.
That's right. So how did they get there? And Cush is more African, if you want to say, because it's more Ethiopia,
right?
Modern than anything else. And according to the rabbi here, he's like, oh, except for not Cush, right?
Yeah.
So there's really a gigantic leap playing on the word Black. That was it. All we need to see is Black. We don't care what the context is. Black, Black people, all the same thing to us. Justifies us from the scripture.
Yeah, I know, and I have seen other texts that could possibly, that's why I asked you, could possibly lead later Christian scholars to looking for Jewish sources to that very racist theory that was propagated. So it's not out of the question, but I would say, and I'm trying to be objective here, I think I am, that the predominant school of thought is that the curse was to Canaan because they were mostly worried about conquering that land. Mm-hmm. They were not worried about enslaving people. In fact, and I won't get to this tonight, but I have a lot of sources which show how the Bible, even though there was slavery, rabbis too, they were very anti-enslavement, and they tried to phase it out. And were, you know, you can't say it was kind, but there was a sense of, for instance, there was you could escape slavery, and you were supposed to harbor fugitives who were ex-slaves. You see this throughout, even in the Bible, but you see it in rabbinic texts too. So, you know, just, I don't think Jewish philosophy felt very good about this, about enslavement, or especially about racism toward blacks. But
Well,
anyway, yes.
One last thing, Goldenberg,
yeah.
and I can't makes a point. If you know, if you can see my finger, has with the HWM is one of the Hebrew words. At least I'm transliterating.
Right.
Under the H, there's a dot.
Yes.
Right. And then there's another H that has almost a smiley face under it. And he says that is actually in the Hebrew text, the H with that smiley face is the one that's used in the original text, which does not represent dark or black.
Yeah, they are very different words if that's the case. But what we see in the Torah now, in the Bible now, is
a dot.
Is the ch sound.
Okay.
I mean, it's spelled the exact same way as hot, and it's very possible that you know, that they sort of interpreted one from the other. But I want to tell you about Cushites.
Yes, please.
Because here, later on, Moses is mocked by Miriam and Aaron, his siblings, for marrying a Cushite woman. And they're punished for it. Miriam gets leprosy for it. It happens in the book of Numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a terrible thing. They're gossiping about their brother. But are they really mocking him for marrying someone of a different color? So what you have in this commentary, this is a midrash, is that, what does it mean to mock her? Because for one thing, she was Midianite, she wasn't Cushite. So what are they, you know, there's a whole different nationality. Her name was Tzipporah. So, and I'll just summarize briefly because there's too much here. But the rabbis said, well, if she was then really what they were saying is that her name Tzipporah means tzefu or u. It takes the Hebrew part. Look and see how beautiful this woman is, this Cushite woman. So she was a Midianite, but they called her a Cushite because, I'm sorry, that's my phone, but I don't have to answer it. They called her a Cushite because in another context in the Bible, the word Cushite was used to, and it shows various places that the Cushites were used to show someone had extraordinary qualities. That had nothing to do with even being a Cushite, but it was used about Cushites because Cushites are exceptional. Now, how are Cushites exceptional? Exceptional because of their appearance. So was Tzipporah, Moses' wife, who was exceptional because of her appearance, of being beautiful. And I think, again, you have this notion of, you know, black is beautiful. It's looking at Cushites in a positive sense, although it isn't always specific about what that sense is. It's Ethiopians, again, and certainly not in a cursed sense. That's really the point I'm trying to make. It's not a curse of black Africans. And this wouldn't even be dealing with the whole enslavement or, you know, issue. So you see a lot of these curses. And then, all right, the mark of Cain. I just want to mention this parenthetically. I'm not going to read all this, but this is from assistant professor at Indiana. I found this material that the mark of Cain and Canaan, although they're spelled a little differently in Hebrew, they tend to be mixed up. And you have a racist legacy of the mark of Cain being dark skin. Cain, of course, being Adam's son, who killed Abel. You know, that was generations before, but he's the ancestor of Noah and Ham. Anyway, so he was cursed with blackness. That's according to this commentary. And together with the more common motif that Noah's son Ham was cursed with black skin and his descendants condemned to slavery, this interpretation of Cain's mark was deployed to justify the slave trade. So evidently, it wasn't just Ham, it was also Cain that was used. The mark of Cain, by the way, was a positive thing. God gave Cain the mark, you might remember, because after he killed Abel, God condemned Cain to wander throughout the earth. There weren't that many people yet, I don't know, but they were afraid that someone would attack him. Cain said, oh, I'll be vulnerable. So God gave him a mark that would then keep people from attacking him. That was a sign that God's protecting this one. But here, it came to be seen as dark skin. It came to be seen in a negative way and a curse. And same thing with anti-Semitism. Here's something where Jews share some of this heritage. St. Augustine even connected the mark of Cain to the observance of Jewish law. And another one called it circumcision specifically. And other Christian readers imagine Cain according to offensive stereotypes of Jews with a hooked nose or horns. So, you can go, I can send you this if anyone is interested, but it's fascinating how you have in the same curse that it's used in anti-Semitic ways and used in racist ways. We all share the mark of Cain.
Yeah. Mark, can I invite us to pause to ask?
Yeah, no, I
questions?
think actually this is the main stuff that I wanted to get through today, because I know that it's a lot to absorb. So please.
Questions, comments?
Any questions? Yeah, anything? Okay. So, I'm going to sort of wrap it up at this point, because I know people are tired. It's just so fascinating how we can use the same sources and come up with very different answers. And that's part of the reason that, I felt it was important to share some of this. When people use this curse of Ham to justify racism, that's horrible. But we can fight that. And then it gets to the general question of how is religion used? Is religion used to perpetuate the crime, in some cases to justify it? Or is it used to fight it? And that brings us back to Heschel and Dr. King. Where really we need to have the audacity, the courage to go deep within our faiths, to go deep within our sources, to respond to hate and not to perpetuate it. All too often, and I see this in Judaism, I can really only speak for my own, but we see it in sort of fundamentalism in general among all faiths. You find this tendency to look at religion as a justifier of a status quo that is unjustifiable. So I think this is hopefully the beginning of a new period for loving your neighbor as yourself. So let me close with one more thing. This one more quote from Rabbi Abram Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King. This is from Heschel. Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for a minimum of reason. So thank you all.
Before we go, I'd want to promote next week.
Yes.
Same time, same back channel on Tuesday. We'll continue the conversation. My hope is to have several Black theologians and pastors to be on the call to kind of share their insight, their perspective on the curse of Ham. And from this presentation, if you have questions as you go throughout the week, you have some well, what if I wanted to ask but didn't? Please send them to Rabbi and myself, and we will address them next week, hopefully. And we hope to see you then. Invite friends, families, foes.
Right. They don't need to have heard this part to fully enjoy the next. In fact, I plan to fully enjoy the next and listen a lot, because I really I need to hear what our guests have to say. And I'm sort of the guest too. I think we're all guests here in this Netherland. So my email address is rabbi@tbe.org. That's templebethel.org, basically. tbe.org, rabbi@tbe.org, and I'd love to hear from you and carry on this conversation.
And mine is easy. It's Christie. I want to also acknowledge Pastor Gilchrist for being here. Maybe she'll present next week as well. I just put my email in the chat. It's Christie with 477777@gmail.com.
Okay. So anyway, thank you all, and we will meet again. And stay safe. And for those who are celebrating Hanukkah, have a happy Hanukkah this week.
Yes, happy Hanukkah.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Okay, be well. Bye.
Good night. Thank you.